So we can go back to Baroness Catherine Ashton, who's been standing by very patiently for us. Baroness Ashton, thanks so much for being with us, and do appreciate your patience. But we got to the point of that there, didn't we, with Putin saying those words about the ceasefire, accepting the idea of it, says it's correct and they support it. But as Ivor was mentioning there, with those caveats, first of all, just your reaction to what you heard and what you make of that.
Really interesting press conference. As I've said before, I've seen Lukashenko and Putin together operating, and it's always fascinating. Also interesting that President Putin talked about the countries of the BRICS. He mentioned Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. He mentioned the other countries as countries who are also taking an interest in what's going on in the war. And that's a common way that he approaches things, is to bring in other countries and to sort of talk about the people that he's having conversations with. So it's not just Russia talking to the Americans or to the Europeans, but a much broader thing. He absolutely is saying, supports the idea of the ceasefire. As Ivor says, how could he not, with everything that he's said and done in the last few weeks? But, and this is my experience, what you then get into is a whole series of details of issues, some of which, of course, are completely legitimate to raise. Who monitors the ceasefire? How will you know it's been violated? What happens if it is? Does it lead on to a permanent set of talks for peace? What does that look like? Who's in the room? All of those questions. But also the detail that is about Russia making sure it's in the best possible position. And those will be very difficult conversations, I think, even for the American envoy to have this evening, and certainly in any conversations with President Trump, but very much setting it up as being Russia and America decides.
Yeah, he made that really clear, didn't he? Say, when talking about who to discuss this with, he said with the United States, not with the Ukrainian or representatives for Ukraine. Look, Baroness Ashton, you know Putin, I guess, as well as anyone that I'm going to be able to speak to about this, and you can perhaps give us some insight into what we can take from his language. He talked about that we agree with these proposals as long as it looks at the original basis for the crisis. Ivor mentioned that might be the NATO forces, but I wonder, Baroness Ashton, if we can read anything into the fact that he hasn't again talked about those maximalist positions, the annexation of those four oblasts, the removal, the denazification of Kyiv in terms of Vladimir Zelensky and his leadership. What do we make of that? Is that just he didn't say it, or has he moved on? I
think when he talks about the original causes, I was right, that there is this sort of now new narrative that did not exist, by the way, in 2013-14 when they took Crimea. That was never part of the discussion at that point. This was about, at that point, Ukraine making a decision that it wanted to look to, if you like, a Western desire to develop its economy, develop its structures, develop itself, much more in a European sense than it did with its sort of traditional historical partner of Russia. And that was where all of that began. So I think it's bigger than just perhaps the issue of NATO, important though that is, because you do know from everything that he said that he does not expect to see the same president in Ukraine. He expects that Zelensky won't be there. He expects that he will not be returning parts of Ukraine to Ukraine. There's an expectation in this. So root causes is a bigger concept than just one thing. And it will be very interesting as the discussions start to see how much of that bubbles up to the surface quite quickly.
Well, surely we'll have to get there pretty quickly now. Look, both sides have said they want a ceasefire, but those points are key to all of this, aren't they? Especially those four oblasts that he's annexed but hasn't got full control of. I mean, are they going to be signed away? Is that part of the agreement, that those are the Ukrainian concessions, or do you have to freeze it where we are right now? It's something that, well, go on, you tell me.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, the thing about a ceasefire is, because, it's an interesting but quite elastic concept. What do we mean? Do we mean everything just stops where it is? And if so, how do you make sure it stays where it is? That means a whole set of things to do with, as I've said, monitoring and so on. Or does it mean that you also build into the ceasefire prisoner exchanges, return of children, that you have people moving back in from their positions. So you create an area that has nobody in it, if you like, is not being governed by either side and so on. Lots of things within it. It's a great word, but many of these sort of diplomatic words I've learned over the years have very elastic concepts. They're very, very challenging to actually turn into something concrete. And reasonably, I mean, some of the things that he has mentioned that they want to know more about, those are things that will have to be discussed and talked about. What I'm not clear about from the American side is how far they have yet worked out what they mean by this and what that will mean in terms of Ukraine. So there's quite a lot of work to do once they've got the principle established. And then the biggest thing of all from that is, whatever it turns out to be, is it a 30-day stop? Is it a 30-day stop with points built into it that build us towards proper negotiations for the long term? We know that these wars will end with what I call ragged edges, not straight lines. It's going to be very difficult and complicated, and it's going to be really, really hard for those doing it. But it will be important that this isn't just a moment in time when something stops, but then starts again within short order.
Look, he's made it really clear he doesn't want NATO forces there to secure the peace, doesn't want European forces there to secure the peace. And that's despite the fact you've heard from the Prime Minister and the President of France saying that some kind of reassurance force could be provided by those two nations. What about forces outside of NATO, outside of the EU? He thanked the leaders of the BRICS. Are we seeing something there that could potentially be a way for some kind of peacekeepers to go in?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, there are two or three things in that. One is the traditional peacekeepers have been the UN, and that's not being talked about. People are not talking about the UN at all in this, which is of itself interesting. Let's just park that. Then you've got this question of, if you use external forces, who decides? Is it an attempt to balance in some way? Do countries want to find themselves being supposedly on one side or the other? And then the whole thing about peacekeepers, again, elastic words. What does it mean? Are these people who are what we used to call blue helmets in the UN context, people who literally are there to monitor and, in a sense, have eyes on the situation? Or are they people who are allowed to engage if there is a problem? In which case, what are the rules of engagement? Who are they responsible to? How is it centrally controlled? What happens between the parties if there's a violation? All of these things, incredibly important, details that need to be worked through, but a lot of work to do before they can be actually put on the ground and in place.
Absolutely right, Baroness Ashton. We've kept you quite long enough, but we do appreciate your expertise, as always. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
All right, let's take you to DC and bring in our US correspondent, Mark Stone. Mark, look, attention is going to turn to that building behind you pretty soon when Mark Rutte, the Secretary-General of NATO, sits down with Trump. But first, your reactions to what we've heard there in Moscow from Putin and Lukashenko.
To see the contours of what this plan for Ukraine might look like from a Russian perspective, and we've just not heard that. It's been the sort of the massive missing piece of this jigsaw for so long, but clearly Putin has very clear views on what it should look like, and he will be discussing those probably right about now with Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's deal-maker-in-chief, who is in Moscow, and we've just heard that the meeting between him and Putin is due to take place this evening. So right. It's an interesting relationship, this one. I was in Miami a couple of weeks ago when Steve Witkoff was talking about his first visit to Moscow, which was about 4 or 5 weeks ago now. That was a visit where he went, on the face of it, to get an American teacher from Pennsylvania out of Russian custody. He achieved that, but in doing so, he clearly formed an important relationship with Vladimir Putin, and it seems to me that that was the beginning of the process which has led us to the point we're at now, where he's able to go specifically to Moscow to talk about Ukraine. And he described having struck up a friendship with Vladimir Putin there. Controversial, yes. Important, a breakthrough diplomatically. Probably yes as well. So that's that. But then, of course, the other bit of the jigsaw, so many bits to it, is NATO. And Mark Rutte is the Secretary-General of NATO. He's the former Dutch Prime Minister, a very, very experienced diplomat, a very experienced politician. a man who knows Donald Trump very well. When Donald Trump was last president, Rutte was the Prime Minister in the Netherlands, so they interacted many times then. Indeed, at NATO meetings when Rutte was there as the Dutch leader, as part of NATO, so they know each other well. Mark Rutte was had last met Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago just after the election in November. He flew straight to Miami to have that meeting in Florida because he recognised back then the difficulty of the relationship that NATO would have with Donald Trump. And my goodness, it's got very, very difficult indeed, probably more difficult than he would have anticipated back then. So I guess you could argue that NATO is, as an alliance, is struggling for relevance at the moment because you've got Britain and France putting forward this proposal for peacekeepers on the ground, which would not be NATO-led because Putin would not want that. So NATO's struggling to work out what its position is. It's clearly having to regroup itself quite quickly because America is clearly not wanting to have a front seat in the NATO partnership, saying that other nations need to pay much more money into the alliance. Mark Rutte has accepted that is the case, and that will be music to Trump's ears here. So expect some chat in the Oval Office when the two of them speak with the cameras rolling about how much other countries are spending on NATO. That will be key, I think. But you know, Kamali, over the years, NATO has transformed itself on a number of occasions. It was once this alliance to deal with the threat of the USSR, the Cold War. It then reformed itself over the course of the 2000s. The only country ever to invoke Article 5 is the United States after 9/11. That then prompted NATO to be a force in Afghanistan. So it's kind of reformed itself. No-fly zones over Libya. It needs to reform itself fundamentally now if America is not to be a central part of it.
Absolutely. All right, Mark, for now in DC, thank you for that. And of course, as Mark was saying there, we're expecting Mark Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, to be speaking with Trump very shortly. We'll go back to DC when that happens. This is the entrance there to the White House, the Marine on the door telling us that the president is inside. Let's go back to the Russian capital, Moscow, and bring our correspondent Ivor Bennett for more on what we heard from President Putin a short while ago. And Ivor, you were talking about some of those caveats that are put in place. And can we just sort of dig into a little bit more on this sort of original basis for the crisis argument that Putin has made? I put to Baroness Ashton, I don't know if you heard, that he's not talking anymore about the sort of the denazification, the complete removal of the Zelensky regime at this point, or is he, Ivor? Is that still sort of just baked into all of this, that has to happen, and those 4 oblasts in the east have to go under Russian auspices?
Yeah, I think even if he didn't mention it specifically, that doesn't mean he's not thinking about it and doesn't mean he doesn't want it. I think it's all baked into this phrase, root causes of the conflict. I think whenever European officials, British officials and probably American officials too, hear that phrase, they probably roll their eyes a little bit because it is something that they dispute, of course, vehemently. They see this war being started with Russian forces invading Ukraine, whereas Moscow claims it was begun as a result of Western aggression and NATO's eastward expansion, which Vladimir Putin blames for forcing his hand, forcing Russia into what he calls a defensive war. And the fact that he's saying that any kind of peace deal has to eliminate these so-called root causes in many ways means we're back to square one. Nothing has really changed because these are lines he's been saying for months, ever since setting out Russia's kind of position on a peace deal last June. So he's talking about peace, saying he wants a ceasefire, but still showing no signs of making concessions or compromises whatsoever. And there were reports this morning from the Reuters news agency citing sources familiar with the Russian position here in Moscow that they have given the American officials 3 demands that they need in order to agree to this 30-day plan for a truce. And those are to have a cast-iron guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO, for there never to be any European peacekeeping troops from NATO forces in Ukraine in the future as part of a security guarantee for Ukraine, and also that there is international recognition that Crimea and those 4 territories in eastern Ukraine that Russia holds the majority of are recognised as Russian territory. So his maximalist position, even if he didn't articulate everything in that press conference, I think has remained the same. And I think just one other thing to add, I think what was interesting were the kind of power dynamics on display in the Kremlin and from Vladimir Putin today. He knew that Steve Witkoff, this envoy of Donald Trump's, his kind of negotiator-in-chief, was coming to Moscow today. He landed around midday here. It's now gone 7 p.m. and he still hasn't met him. Instead, he's held lengthy bilateral talks with Alexander Lukashenko and then this long press conference, all of which was only announced yesterday. And I'm sure it's no coincidence that this happened today, the same day as Steve Witkoff came to the Russian capital. And I think it's designed to show that Vladimir Putin is not going to be pushed into anything. He likes to be the one in charge. He likes to be the one calling the shots. So as he's been in the Kremlin having these talks with Alexander Lukashenko, Steve Witkoff has been made to wait, and they will be meeting at some point, but it's all on Vladimir Putin's terms, and it's all designed to show that he is still the one in charge.
Keeping the schedule. And I can just update you and our viewers, Ivor, that the Witkoff meeting with Putin is expected to be underway imminently. That's according to a source that's been briefed on the matter. But as you say, he arrived midday. He's been waiting, going on 6 hours now. Maybe he'll wait a little bit longer, but that meeting is due to begin very, very soon. Ivor, thanks so much for now in Moscow. Let's bring in Professor Michael Clark, our military analyst, for his thoughts on this. Professor Clark, before I get you to sort of talk broadly about what we heard from Putin there, why don't you just tell us, talk specifically about what we heard Putin talk about for the Kursk region. He talked about the Ukrainians there being encircled and used the phrase that they have 2 options now, either die or surrender.
Yeah, he was a little bit ambiguous about that, Kamali, because he began, when he was asked about Kursk, he began by saying, well, it's all over. But then he said, well, it will be all over quite soon. And he then seemed to clarify the fact that Ukrainian forces are more or less surrounded, but not completely surrounded. And I think that's consistent with what we can see. There's certainly the pocket that they're in is closing to the south. I mean, yesterday we were looking at it. It looks as if there was a gap of about 30 kilometres that they could escape back into Ukraine through. But that gap may be closing quite quickly. One would expect it to. The Russians have put 50,000 troops into the area. And the Ukrainians have got about 15,000 troops, so it's a complete mismatch, and the Ukrainians have been holding on. But I think that's where we are. And he was also interesting. He said, why would we make a peace deal for 30 days before we've snuffed out the Kursk pocket? Before, what would happen to these Ukrainian troops who would then be given some ability then just to walk home? So I think undoubtedly he's very confident that he will suppress the Kursk pocket. He'll get all the Ukrainians out of it. But I don't think he's done it yet. He started by saying he had, then he seemed to back off a little bit as he dealt with some of the detail.
Well, Michael, another reading of it, I mean, my reading of it, was a bit of a blackmailing threat. I mean, he said, what's going to happen to these guys? Are they going to be mobilised, retrained, resupplied? Is he saying to Zelensky and others, I've got your boys in the pocket, and if you don't accede to some of my demands over the next 30 days, they're gone?
Yeah, he might think that way. Indeed. I mean, if there are several thousand Ukrainians there, they certainly don't want to get cut off because they would be hostages, undoubtedly so. And then when he said, what would happen in this 30-day ceasefire, the Ukrainians would just re-equip and they'd rearm and they'd reorganise themselves. You bet your life they would, exactly as you will be doing. If there's a 30-day ceasefire, both armies will do what armies always do when they get a 30-day pause. They'll re-equip, they'll rethink themselves, they'll reorganise themselves. Both armies will do exactly the same thing. I mean, he was sort of pretending that the Russian army would not move and the Ukrainians would somehow get an advantage from the 30-day pause. Both armies will get an advantage from the 30-day pause in purely tactical issues.
He seemed to want to get into some of the detail as well about how the peace could be kept in the event this ceasefire lasts, talking about the 2,000-kilometre line. He said, who's going to adjudicate any violations of all of that? So in his mind, I guess, he's already started to think about that. Talk to us about that 2,000-kilometre line, though, Michael. What is he describing there?
Yeah, I mean, his figure was wrong on that. It's 1,200 kilometres, but it's still a very, very long line of contact. And, I mean, as Cathy Ashton was saying, I mean, you can say, let's have a ceasefire. That sounds simple. But what will it really mean? How do you monitor it? It's a very long line to monitor. And do you mean that troops will withdraw a kilometre or a couple away from the line of contact? So you have an empty line, and who's going to have a look at that? If the troops are still facing each other, there will be incidents on a daily basis. I mean, how do you legislate against that? Somebody's got to decide before any incident really gets out of hand how to snuff it out. And the idea of a force, an enforcement force, a reassurance force, is a very difficult one to imagine, because anyone who actually turns up at an area of that, in that line of contact, that long line of contact, where something is broken down, there's fighting, any force that turns up to try to restore order will end up fighting. And so I don't think many countries will be keen to put their troops into that situation. All of these are problems down the road. And we all know that. We've been talking about it for the last 2 or 3 weeks. But by bringing it up at this press conference, Putin is making it clear that there will be lots and lots of things to talk about. Because, of course, he's not going to say no to US proposals. He's going to say yes, but. And the but comes but. So he'll have lots and lots of issues which he will raise. And this will be a test of the patience, really, of Steve Witkoff and the Trump team. They'll want to do this quickly, in big handfuls. And the Russians will do what they always do, which is take it to the end of the very line. They will actually make it last a long time and try to keep raising technical issues which will be difficult for the Ukrainians to match.
Yeah, well, he's about to meet that man, Witkoff, imminently, we are told. We'll find out what those buts are. Professor Clark, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for your expertise, as always. Now, as we're looking at the door of the White House, the President, Donald Trump, is due to meet the Secretary-General of NATO, Mark Rutte, imminently, where they'll be discussing those ceasefire proposals. As in the last hour, President Putin has said that Russia agrees with the proposals, he agrees with the ceasefire, but now has questions on how it will be implicated, and perhaps there is going to be, in the short term, a phone call with President Trump. That's all from the team here on Sky News Today. Coming up next, it will be Business Live with Darren McCaffrey.